Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Fela, Author Meets Reader, Engaging Fela and Me by Sandra Izsadore, produced by Kraft Book. It's a great honor and privilege for me to chair this panel and also to organize this panel to celebrate an individual who's been a much part of African and African diaspora connection, particularly within the field of cultural studies and particularly popular music. So the impulse to sort of organize this panel comes from my ongoing second doctoral dissertation, which attempts to sort of account for the contribution of female and queer artists to popular music in Nigeria. And in Nigeria specifically, but more broadly in Africa and African diaspora. It seems to me, in my reading of current literature, that it seems that the social production of music and the scholarly production of music itself tends to have a masculine aura. And for me, I think that women have been really central to this, and Professor Kibona has engaged this very critically in our work. A book chapter on gender and popular music was a very fundamental aspect of my reading list last year. So here's be the order of the program after this brief remark and the impulse or the motivation for organizing this panel. I'll introduce the panelists. Each of them will have 15 minutes each to speak about how they respond to the personal narrative of someone that I'm used to calling her the queen mother of Afrobeat, but Sandra Izsadore on our role, not just in relationship to Fela, which has always has been documented in some sense, but marginally to my understanding, I think she's been part of book chapter in Carlos' work on Fela and all of that. But I think that she deserves not just honoring of our contribution, but also using celebration of our contribution to Afrobeat as part of the broader way to continuing the conversation around African and African American relationship and the ways in which we're in many ways connected and the many tensions that seek to divide us. So the panelists are not new to those who are familiar with cultural studies and particularly popular music. Professor Mr. Kibona Clark's work on hip hop in Africa is a widely cited book that I think, if it's not referenced in any work on popular music, that work would definitely not be respected or be acknowledged. And of course, we have Professor Shipley's work on hip hop and celebrity culture in Ghana, chapter 8 of which I really the chapter 8 of that book is really fundamental to how I'm engaging gender and popular music in West Africa itself. And I think that also Professor Mike Bill needs no introduction to anyone who has been really part of, African American study and particularly African and African American studies, cultural studies broadly, and particularly popular music. And my dear friend, Professor Oluwatoyin Olokojano James, who I just met recently, and I watched a beautiful performance that she did for an ongoing cultural production on Fuji and popular music broadly lately. And so without taking much of our time, I would like each of the presenters make their presentation based on the order in which it appears on the program. And before I hand over the floor to Professor Kibona Clark, I just want to say thank you to every panelist who's been created time out of their very busy schedule to be part of this panel. I know how busy you are personally and professionally, and and considering also the time difference, I just want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate as a junior scholar coming up and looking up to you all as the doing of the field, as the shepherd of the field of cultural studies. So I'll hand over the floor to Professor Kibona Clark for a presentation for 15 minutes. And when it's 2 minutes, I will send you a reminder. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm definitely a fan of, excuse me, the work of my fellow panelists. I know Jesse's work has definitely influenced my work. It's our first time, I think, even seeing each other like live. So it's great. So yeah, thank you for the invite. So it's definitely, I think one of just looking at my thoughts on the text, one of the other areas that I've worked a lot on is relationships between I'm sorry, I think in the morning my voice has not quite woken up, but one of the other areas I focused on is relationships between Africans and African Americans, both in the US and on the continent. And I think that that is one of the other things that this text really speaks to. And I wasn't really I didn't know what to expect. And I think that that was one of the things I did not want to kind of like pre-prepare. So not knowing what to expect, I think was great. So I just kind of went in blind and, was pleasantly surprised to be able to get not only this glimpse into this relationship with Fela, but then also kind of having lived in LA for 6 years and kind of really getting a lot of the history of 1960s LA and meeting some of the people who were in the Panther Party and in the US organization, hearing stories about what happened at UCLA and all of these things. So it was like it brought a lot of those stories back. And having heard about the impact of LA on Fela's movie, I think starting off the book, that was very impactful. And so I think that I say that to say for individuals who may not know that is a component of the book, I think it's important to kind of to say that. And I think the weaving of those connections and that kind of those interactions between the diaspora and African communities, I think is something that is critical because later on, of course, these things are happening in Nigeria. And I think the perceptions of Africans, who Africans are, the perceptions of Sandra, I think are important. And I think though one of the biggest contributions that the book makes is that we often don't hear from the voices of women who are in relationships with men, especially men like Fela. When you think of like Fela, you think of Bob Marley, you think of the women that surrounded them. They are very much anonymous unless some of the really 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 diehard fans who kind of took the time, but even then their voices are not heard. And I think oftentimes that's intentional. I think they're marginalized. I think no one wants to hear their voices. I think there are certain assumptions that are made about those women. And I think having a text that one is unapologetic about speaking and saying that yes, I have a voice, and not only do I have a voice, but I also had an impact, and I had an impact on the music, and I had an impact on the narrative. And it also kind of not only gives us this insight into kind of the things that were going on, especially in the later years of Fela's life, and kind of what was going on and some of the things that kind of foretold his illness and his eventual demise. But I think also understanding the impact of specifically Sandra in his life, but I think also women in his life. And so we think of the women that surrounded Fela, we often think of from the outside of women is kind of, and I think we do this with all artists, as decoration, as interchangeable, and not taking them seriously. But I think I like the idea that it presents a multi-dimensional perspective and gives voice and centers and gives agency to those women, and is a representation of specifically one of those women. And so I definitely, and I know that even though it does that, there will still be people who will feel that this particular woman, should not be speaking, that it is not your place to speak. And I think also it should be noted that had this book been written, even if it had been written today, even if it had been written by someone today, I mean, you still would have that, you know, because those ideas still exist today, you would probably still have a lot of that reaction. But I think, especially given the time frame in which this text is written, I think that definitely those ideas of women in respectability politics were very prominent. And I wonder, I wonder if the book could have been published earlier, you know, what the reception would have been if it had been published earlier. And so, but yeah, I mean, even now when we look at voices of women who do speak and who do kind of talk about their experiences, the backlash. So I'm definitely, yeah. So it's definitely, I'm definitely going to be interested in that. Of course, I have questions for the author in terms of some of the reception that she's gotten, and also kind of plans for the book in terms of the market and all of that, because I definitely, you know, think that the book should be shared, and I'm definitely interested in, you know, getting more information on the reception. But I highlighted quite a bit in there in terms of, and I think a lot of it that I highlighted, quite honestly, was selfishly information that was less about generating discussion and more things like historical information that I didn't know. Um, so yeah, so there was a lot of information, like I said, behind the scenes information, like the whole idea of kind of going back and forth to Ghana and moving around without a visa. I mean, I think a lot of us know about moving throughout the continent, and there are ways when you're, you know, bordering countries. I mean, it's very, there are ways that you can kind of move without kind of going through the official border crossing. But to realize the frequency with which this was going on, and I mean, it's not necessarily surprising, but I think it is amusing, the, you know, the frequency with which this happened with Fela, given his relationship with the Nigerian government at the time. And so the idea that, you know, her life was in danger and Fela's life was in danger, but also, you know, the relationship with the other women, I think that was, you know, definitely very fascinating. There were things that I think some of this I do want to hold off for the Q&A. So I want to give the other panelists an opportunity to speak. But yeah, no, I think that I was trying to find one of the things that I had highlighted. But looking at the influence of African American culture, and specifically African American politics at the time on Fela, one of the things that I've always found compelling about Fela is the influence of the music and the politics on Fela, who then would later have an influence on the music in the diaspora. And so when we look at the then diaspora music having an influence back on the youth in the continent, so this idea that like hip hop music, or even, you know, to some extent, you know, hip life, Afrobeats, the critique of, is it African enough, or does it have too much Western influence? You would not say that about Fela's music, although there was a heavy dose of influence from Los Angeles, from African American music, African American culture. But we, you know, now would not, definitely not critique, and I don't even know if that critique existed when, you know, when Fela was producing this music. So it's just also very kind of interesting to see that, you know, also that cycle of back and forth between the diaspora and West Africa. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the comments I have regarding the text.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. And there's so much you nailed in the presentation that I don't want to go over, so that we can have more time for other presenters to be able to make their presentation. But one particular thing that I also want to add to what you had said is, when I told someone I was organizing this panel, the person asked me a question: what can self-writing, personal self-writing like this contribute to cultural studies? And I said, so many things it can contribute. And if you want to know more, come here from Professor Clark, Professor Shipley, and Professor Veal, and of course, Professor Olopodona James and all. But thank you so much for many salient points. And the question reception, receptibility towards, the idea, the partner narrative, the vulnerability with which she wrote about very personal things was very humbling for me. The transparency and so many things that I can go on and talk about. And so thank you so much for all that you have said. I think we will have more to discuss during the Q&A session. Now I'll move to Professor Oluwatoyin Olokodano, who is seated with me here live in Lagos.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I have been introduced already, so I'll go straight into the presentation. I was hoping to see Sandra Izzadore's face, unfortunately. So I want to see whether you have maintained that beauty over the years. Let me say that I was happy when I first got the invitation.
I think we need to exchange space so you can.
Oh, really?
You can just go ahead and make a presentation.
Sure. Let me say that I was happy when I first got the invitation to be part of the panel, which for LS is 2024. And I'm still happy to be here. I understand that it's a book review, but I will not follow the conventions of book review. I just want to tell my own story and my own perspective from my own deductions from the book. So I've decided to title my work. And my presentation today will be titled Women, next page, please. Women in Fela's Social Musical Worldview, a dimensional critique of Sandra Izzadore's Fela and Me. I understand that from my own perspective, I think that this book is basically an autobiographical presentation of certain facts about the relationship between Fela and Sandra Izsadore, and I'm happy that I'm making this book. I will focus on two key areas, and this will include Fela and the women, and of course, the second part will be Fela and Sandra Izsadore, their meeting, their relationship, and the question is, to what extent? I may have one or two questions for the author at the end of this presentation. I definitely will have one question for her. Now, let me start by saying that when I first got the invitation for this review, I didn't know what to do. And so I started making calls and all that. And then I told myself that I needed to do some background check to be sure that this work in particular is not a replication of any material out there. So in reading my literature, I came across a lot of works that have some kind of connection with this particular text. The first is by Justin Labridge, who has described Fela in one of his articles as a social realist, and then Karim Ubolu discussing Fela's performances and his achievements as a musician. Adeko Ogbe discusses the potency of some of Fela's music, looking at Fela as more of an idealist, a philosopher, a Protestant, and all that. Now, in the case of Randakas, his identity, his philosophy, and understanding of Fela is deep-rooted in Fela's revolutionary and rebellious nature, his confrontational stance, and Fela's obliteration of performance as something existing separate from life. Felix Oludare Angela, I'm happy that he's right here with us. I'm happy to have you. He's written about Fela's fight against authoritarianism and neoliberal orthodoxy. Now, two other aspects that seem to have attracted a lot of works would include Fela's masculinity, and this would include the works of Derek Stanowski, who wrote about Fela's masculinity, polygamy, and his misogynist identity. And of course, Dr. Ayobade, who wrote on Queens of Kalakuta. Now, one would say that after reading all of this material, I came to the conclusion that this book has not replicated any of this material, but this book offers deeper perspectives into all of these materials. Now, this book has 295 pages, and basically concerns Fela and Sandra Izsadore and their personal experiences. The thematic areas, the thematic perspective from this book include Fela and Sandra's meeting, Sandra's childhood, their meeting in 1969, the relationship between them and of course the other women, the educational impact and sociocultural influences, the conceptual structures, theories, and licenses of Fela's works, the the sociological cultures of opposite. I particularly like this chapter because it talks about the Ikoyi. It's some kind of comparative discourse about the Ikoyi and she experienced. Then you also see another thematic area which could include Fela and Sandra's Abeokuta and Ghana experiences, which of course the first thing mentioned. Then Fela's US tour and his return to Nigeria. His tour in the US as a non-documented immigrant. And Fela, Afrobeat, the band, and of course, Fela's harrowing days leading to his death. And like I said, I'm concerned about women. And that's something that this book has offered. And like the first speaker noted, most times when you talk about women in the life of any particular so any particular musician, anybody that is sort of accomplished, you hardly see the influence, you hardly see the impact of these women. That's exactly what this book has done. This book, beyond looking at these women as non-significant elements in the life of this man, has built a lot of information, a lot of information, a lot of perspectives about women at different times in the life of this man. Now, let me also know that Fela knew that he needed to subject his sexuality and his masculinity to work. As a musician, you just have to do that to promote your work. And so Fela surrounded himself with a lot of women. Interestingly, this book has offered to let us know that these women may have played very minor roles, but they had very significant impacts in the life of this man. Now, the authors revealed these women in different capacities, in different categories, at different times, in different chapters in this work of art. I refer to this as a work of art. Now, I have categorized these women into 6 different categories. And the first one would feature the feminist activist, Fumilayo Ramson Kuti, Fela's mother. If you look at the video, you will discover that there seems to be some kind of triangular movements between Fela's music, Fela's mother as the first person, the first one that he had contact with, and of course, Fela's music, Fela's identity, and Fela's music. So the role and impact of this woman in Fela's life can never be underestimated. Should never be underestimated. Now, the second category would feature Remi Taylor, his wife, and of course, the dancers, the 24 dancers that eventually became his wives. You cannot rule out the import or the influence of these dancers in the life of this man during his time on earth. Now, the third category would feature Sandra Izsadore as the Black rights activist. I will talk more about her when I start discussing the other part of my thematic concern. Now, this photo has described bedmates. I am fascinated by the use of the word bedmates. I, for instance, will hardly use the word bedmates to describe companions. But this photo has used bedmates. Say that, from my own understanding, they are bedmates, but they were not restricted to playing that role as bedmates because they did a lot of other things. For instance, we talked about the influence of Fela in the US. When the troop had a lot of issues, it was Helen that bought a musical instrument for the band, which Fela played over there, and even when he returned to Nigeria to kickstart his musical career. Now, another category will feature the dancers. In most cases, when you talk about dancers, you hardly see them beyond the ephemeral stage. You hardly see them beyond perform. Really, okay, dancers and of course the social cultural influencers, admirers, and acquaintances. I'm going straight into looking at. Okay, let me say this: that in the whole of Fela's life, these women featured in Fela's sociological worldview, influencing his musical career and the psychosocial orientation of many of his books, particularly the first 3 categories of women. Now, Fela and Sandra Izsadore, the question is to what extent? I will start by saying again that, like I said earlier, in most of the works, you hardly find that kind of detail about the relationship of these women in the life of this man, especially Sandra Izsadore. Now, I don't know whether this was a conscious thing or an unconscious thing, but Sandra presented three specific identities of herself in this work. The first identity was cast against the background of curiosity, of condemnation, of insecurity, and all that. The second identity was cast against the background of the search for the African true identity, going through transformation, going through acquiring knowledge, acquiring self-confidence, self-esteem, and so on and so forth. And the last part was becoming the Black rights activist. Now, Sandra, as a very young girl, knew that she had a lot of issues as a Black young African child who lived mostly within white communities. She had a lot of issues because many of them even condemned her. She knew that she was different from a lot of people. She had a lot of questions, and these questions were never really answered. However, that was some kind of moment of transition for her. Because in her own words, that was what started the journey. It was the negative, harsh reawakening from the white children in the neighborhood and the teasing by my own cousins who had not been taught about the greatness of Black achievements and contributions in the world that started my journey. The difference in my life was my own questioning, just the innate feeling that there had to be more to us as a race than the images that were presented to us. That is to say that Sandra knew early enough that she needed to be different. She needed to respond to a lot of things. And all of this started at the age of 18 when she eventually met Fela. Now, from the reading of this book, I would also describe Sandra as a seductress who knew what she wanted. I mean, just like Fela, who knew what he wanted, Sandra also knew what she wanted. And so when she met Fela, from the very first day that they met, the eye contact, the experience registered something deeper than the familiarity of the first timer. And Sandra knew immediately that she had met her Mr. Right, our own Fela, our own musician, popular musician. Now, because of my time, I will go straight to my conclusion. And I'll say that if anybody at all ever influenced Sandra socioculturally, if anybody ever influenced Fela socioculturally, it was Sandra. Because it was Sandra that led his path to the idea about African identity. Fela became interested in learning about the ideologies and philosophies of great men because of Sandra's influences. And I would say that Sandra brought truth to Fela scientifically because of the evidential facts, the experiences, the personal experiences, and all that. She brought truth to Fela socioculturally, but most importantly, sexually. And we know what that can do to any performer. On the other hand, Fela indoctrinated Sandra into the African way of doing things, the African experience, the African perspective, and so on and so forth. Finally, I'll say the book is basically a compendium of a lot of things and a lot of perspectives. The work is a great contribution to knowledge in Africa and indeed the entire world. My question is, this book has to a very large extent revealed much about patriarchy and polygamy in Africa, but Sandra's upbringing has been that of monogamy. How you were able to move from the monogamy identity and mentality to becoming a polygamist really beats my imagination as an African. Now, do you think that if you were not in love or if Fela was not a superstar, you still would have accepted polygamy? Or was it just the inability to accept exclusion that made polygamy safe as part of African culture? Thank you.
Wow.
So much time.
Thank you so much. Don't be surprised by Professor Olokudano creating a cast of characters of the people in the book. She's a dramatist or a dramatologist, and somebody who is deeply involved with theater and performance, and a doctoral dissertation entirely on that, if I understand that correctly. Thank you so much for your presentation. There's so much to say in the few minutes, but I would want to go to the panelists. But before I do that, one of the things that make the book of very much interest to me is that questions I'm dealing with in my own doctoral dissertation is, can we understand female popular artists beyond their appendage to popular male artists as wives, as lovers. And more importantly, I love the fact that, and I think that Professor Clark did mention that earlier, the fact that the Queen Mother, in many ways, distinguished herself from the ways in which we sort of make the women in Fela's life look monolithic. Every now and then, people report about the 27 wives, as though they are this monolithic set of people, women with diversities of experience and identity. And it's one of the reasons I look forward so much to reading a very important book that just been published by Dotun Ayobade on the Kalakuta Queens. Too much time, I'll move to Professor Shipley, whose work is also very important around gender, popular music. And I think later on, when it's Q&A time, Queen Mother, I want you to get ready to respond to some of the questions and the curiosities raised. But for now, I hand over to Professor Shipley. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing this. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I apologize for not being in Lagos. I wish I could be there, but I'm teaching this summer. So sending all my greetings. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this group. I've taught both of my fellow Zoom panelists work, and I'm very excited to be part of this conversation with esteemed colleagues. I'll try and bring my perspective to this work. Also, thanks to the author for writing a brilliant book and for sharing fearlessly a set of experiences which I think enrich our understanding of music as well as global politics, as well as circuits of movement that I think are really crucial for us to understand. So let me offer a couple of points that I think we can hopefully expand upon in the Q&A. As our esteemed organizer pointed out, I've written a lot about gender and popular music, particularly around the rise of a certain moment of hip hop music in Ghana, which in some ways owes its whole foundation to the moment that we're looking at here, the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, and then into the 80s. And one of the dynamics that I think is crucial that we see in this work is the ways in which the sort of complicated ambivalences around gender and sexuality, the ways in which popular music is driven by a certain kind of desire and pleasure, and the dynamics, gender dynamics, which are both incredibly productive on individual and collective levels, and producing a certain idea in audiences of what music does and can do, and in performance creates a kind of intensity and a power. And I think we see that very much in this book, the way in which the pleasure, the desire, the possibility that emerges in popular music emerges in and through gendered relationships, through sexuality, through the possibilities of sex in its best possible sense. At the same time, there's a danger and there's a tension of what that means, and particularly in some measure, who gets voiced, who doesn't get voiced, those kinds of issues that I think that this book really carefully highlights. The things that stood out to me in particular that were really exciting have to do with the confluences of place. So we start in LA, we narratively start moving back and forth, which I think speaks to the moment, but LA in the 60s, Lagos, London, Accra briefly, the ways in which places become not geographically distant, but markers of what music does and what relationships are. I love the way the book is written from this very intimate perspective on figures that we might know in other ways. The way in which Obasanjo comes in, who is, a crucial political figure, a crucial military leader. But we see Obasanjo as someone who's tied into Fela in other kinds of ways, and through his infliction of a certain kind of violence. But we read it from the perspective of on-the-ground sensibility. And I think that's really valuable for understanding how musicians and people who are performers themselves understand meaning versus how it might appear to be something else from a greater distance. So how does like a performer or someone deeply embedded in creating and producing something experience the world? That's one of the things I got from this, is the ways in which artists and creators are always seeing things from a slightly more interesting and intimate perspective. They play with perspective. They play with their experience, and they have a kind of rawness of sensibility, which I think is very different than the lens of the audience and very different than the lens of certain kinds of scholarly work. Obviously, the crucial thing going on here also has to do with the African diasporic and various African connections around politics, around music, and how those have always been central to the production of both diasporic music as well as African music. And playing out and looking at those specificities is something that still gets lost a bit. Like when we look, the fact that Afro beats with an S has blown up in the last decade and really in the last few years, obviously is crucial for us as scholars and as artists ourselves to think about how and why did that happen now? And Fela, as this kind of generational global genius, how does his work lay the foundations for it? But also, how do we understand the changing moments of digital communication, the changing global networks that allow something that's always been going on to suddenly explode? 20 years ago, I brought some Nigerian musicians and I was helping bring West African artists to New York. And, there would be a couple hundred people interested. Suddenly you have Burna Boy, was it last year or 2 years ago, selling out Madison Square Garden. You have the circuits and the networks of connection, which create a different set of commercial possibilities. And then we have to ask ourselves, what are the musical compromises that are made, or what are the ways in which commercial acceptability and viability relates to the explicit political messages, but also the implicit ideas about diasporic politics and connection that have always been embedded in this kind of set of genres of music. The other thing that strikes me as a non-musician, speaking around people who are musicians, is the way in which audiences and listeners and publics think about genre versus how, for musicians, they play with styles in such fluid kinds of ways. Because here we see different kinds of jazz music, different kinds of high life music, different kinds of forms at play, and this kind of percussive brilliance of someone like Tony Allen. And then how do those kind of genres that are for musicians kind of constantly sort of being riffed off of and played with in performance and in recordings, how do they get characterized and turned into something that's marketable or pushed aside because they're not seen as marketable? And how does a changing sort of record industry or music industry, whatever that looks like, sort of parse out and kind of think about popularity? In the 60s, 70s, 80s, how does that look different or similar today when we have the internet, which limits things in some ways, but also opens up things in another kind of way? A couple other questions that I wanted to ask really have to do with genre and sort of context. So, and these are things that just strike me based on what I'm working on right now. I'm writing a book about the 1979 coups in Ghana, the coup d'etat, June 4th, 1979 in Ghana. I'm writing an extended book on this, which brought Jerry John Rawlings to power for the first time. So I'm very much fascinated with these kinds of connections of the popular, of mass movements, and then of politics and violence. So I'm thinking about the students who I interviewed, or people who were students in the 1970s, who are now in their 60s, who were protesting General Champagne in Ghana by singing Fela Zombie, by shouting at the soldiers, Fela's music. And Fela, and I'm talking to musicians who had known Fela in the late 60s when he's in Accra. And looking at these kinds of networks and what kind of place Accra was as a cosmopolitan center, but quiet and small and intimate compared to Lagos and compared to LA. But how does Fela movement to Accra influence what's going on there, as well as how do these kind of spaces become sort of nodes on the global landscape? And in some ways you can trace the kind of the afterlife of these kinds of sort of experiences. You still hear about Fela in Accra. And as people think about Accra as a space of return right now, where the government is trying to really encourage diasporic return in a very complicated way, how do we trace older forms of connection? And Accra and Lagos as being this kind of intimately connected spaces over decades, over a century. How do we think about those relations? High life music is something that's not even one single genre, of course, but something that ties into something from the 50s, 60s, 70s. If Ghana becomes independent from British rule in 1957, I remember talking to Chinua Achebe about how he was listening to Kwame Nkrumah speak at independence. He's listening to Nkrumah's speech, March 6, 1957, as he's conceiving of Things Fall Apart. How various musicians are listening across, how bands are going back and forth between Ghana and Nigeria. The more recent kind of rivalries between the two, I think, are very fascinating. And they tie into kind of musical sensibilities that are really crucial. And then the last thing I would say before stopping is, because I've become obsessed with thinking about politics of coup d'etat in the 70s. What do we think about the idea of populism and its actual political afterlives? How do we see the relationship between an incredibly transformative concert, for example, in which young people predominantly can experience the possibility of seeing the world differently, experience a certain kind of freedom? How do we see that in relation to the idea of actual political change? When we see someone like Obasanjo kind of coming in some ways as a personal kind of thing, destroying Fela's world. But then what does that mean in sort of the broader political landscape when this is someone who is, the head of a military regime and then becomes elected later? But I'm thinking about the 70s as this space where people felt like there was a sense of possibility. The late 60s and 70s, people felt like the world was going to change, and it could change for the better. And that revolutionaries, Black Panthers, were aligning with musicians, and those kinds of conversations were really crucial and timely and felt heated, like there could really be a better political world, that it didn't have to be limited to the stage. And then what does that look like today? Do we see that in contemporary music? Do we see that in contemporary potential movements? I'm not a political scientist. I'm not interested in sort of top-down boring analyses, but I'm really interested in the ways in which music and popular culture promise certain ideas and possibilities, and then thinking about the longue durée, what happens to those ideas that start with kind of musical brilliance, or start with style, or start with painters, or whatever it might be, but where do they go? What happens to them after the concert? What happens to them when things enter into the marketplace? And in some ways, this book really points to those things, sort of tracing the hauntings of past possibilities and their afterlives and where we find them today. So I really want to thank the author again for writing this amazing book. It sort of sent my mind in all sorts of directions. And I look forward to sort of continuing the conversation with my fellow panelists and audiences there. So let me turn it back over to you as our convener. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And there's so much to sort of, nail on or conversation starters and many things you said. But one that I think seems to be recurrent in the conversation is to use the word of Professor Shipley, the confluence of places, the marriage of the movements from Hele to Ghana to Nigeria, and many things. And of course, the question of martial acceptability that you talk about with popular music and politics and culture. And I think that is also important. When I organized this panel and shared with my mentor about my interest in this panel, and it was very fundamental to encouraging me to pursue this idea of articulating the voices of women in popular music beyond the appendage as wives, as lovers, but particularly to center women's agency, individual and personal narrative, and how useful can that be in helping us read the history of popular music against the grain. I'm particularly centering this book in my work as part of my work as one of the ways I'm reading the history of popular music in Nigeria against the grain of the overriding image of men like Fela, like Ebenezer Obey, and the likes of them, but more so to sort of center women. And the ways in which gender in Africa and African diaspora sort of aligns and also differs from each other, like Professor Kodena was asking with the question of polygamy, is also very fundamental to me. Finally, before I hand over to Professor Mike Bill, someone asked me, how did I get the guts of the discipline, the doyens of the field to be on this panel? My response is the fact that I think the ancestors want us to have this panel. So thank you so much for agreeing to be on this panel, and I will hand over the floor to you, sir.
Is that me that you just handed the floor over to?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Excuse me. Thank you. because it's early here in New York. And for Sandra, just everyone should remember Sandra's in Los Angeles, so that's 3 hours earlier than here. So it's 5:30 in the morning where she is. So I wouldn't be on camera either if it were 5:30 in the morning. But I get it. Um, I haven't really prepared a formal presentation, but I just like to thank you for the invitation, and it's great to be here with everyone. And so I'm just going to lay out a handful of bullet points, which can be elaborated in the question and answer session. Just things that we can think about as we discuss. And some of them have already been mentioned. Um, First of all, I appreciate the book. I love reading the book, and I appreciate the panel. I think the panel is a great testament to the contribution of a unique and very powerful African American woman who who needs to be uh, more explicitly acknowledged in the Fela narrative. I think, in fact, Fela himself was very explicit and effusive in his acknowledgement of Sandra and her influence on his life and his music. And I think Sandra was more explicitly acknowledged in his book, for example, his autobiography with Carlos Moore, than any other woman in his life except maybe his mother. So I think that's something to keep in mind. I mean, Sandra was acknowledged in the Broadway musical about Fela's life. She was a central figure in that narrative. Um, and so it's great to see her finally getting the acknowledgement that she deserves in Nigeria itself and on the African continent itself. Um, I think the book is an amazing testament to the era of African and African American interaction. Um, there are people who talk about Fela as if he never left Abeokuta or he never left Lagos or he never left Nigeria. And, even if we look at it in musical terms, obviously there would be no Fela without people like Victor Olaya and Bobby Benson and Cardinal Rex Jim Lawson and E.T. Mensah. That's obvious. But there would also be no Fela without James Brown and John Coltrane, to cite two diasporic musicians who were absolutely fundamental to what he did with his style of music that he invented. But in terms of the era of African and African American interaction, I think Sandra's book is great because it's multidimensional. It's encoded with all the conflicts and the cooperations and the rivalries and the communications and the miscommunications and the understandings and the misunderstandings and the epiphanies and the dead ends. It's all there in her book because Sandra's a very honest and forthright and down to earth person. She doesn't try to uh, make the story prettier or uglier than it needed to be. She just presents it as she experienced it. I think the book it's an organic, visceral document of the idea of. It seems like someone needs to be muted. There's some noise in the background. Um, of yeah, a great document of Pan Africanism as it filtered down into the sphere of popular culture, and even as it filtered into the domestic sphere. Um, I'll wait till Rosemary comes back. Yeah, so Pan Africanism, as it filtered down into the sphere of popular culture, and even as it filtered into the domestic sphere. Um, you know, Sandra, in fact, is someone who was not only a very close associate of Fela, but for example, she was a close friend of Bob Marley. She was a close friend of Peter Tosh. So this is someone who's had an amazing life story, and in that time period, who was moving through not only the African and the African American articulations of the Pan-Africanist ideal, but also the Afro-Caribbean articulations of that. And Bob Marley performed uh, in Zimbabwe during this time period. Peter Tosh and other Jamaican musicians like Muda Baruka, who was also very political, toured Nigeria at this time. And I should also mention about Sandra, um, that she was involved in the European side of the equation with people, when Fela's career began to branch out into the European market, and his handlers, especially people in France like Pascal Imbert and Martin Messonnier and Francis Kertekian. All of these people, the foundations of what later became the world beat movement or the world music market, as was kind of strategized in London with people like Chris Blackwell, and strategized in Paris with people like the people I just mentioned. She was in the middle of that too. So she's really got a number of dimensions on this whole Pan-Africanist narrative, and the Fela dimension is probably the best known dimension, but it's by no means the only dimension of her involvement in that. Um, as everyone has mentioned so far, this book really gives agency to the topic of the women around Fela. I think a number of people have mentioned Dotun Ayobade's forthcoming book on Fela's Queens. That book is a pretty monumental achievement, I would say. I mean, it's 500 or 600 pages long. It's a very thick, very comprehensive, detailed book on the lives of those queens, the ones that survived. And I think it's one of the most important books about in the whole Fela narrative. It just came out a few weeks ago, so I'm very excited about that book. Um, I think Sandra's book foregrounds the role of Black women in liberation movements. I think most of the narratives about the liberation movements of that era and the activism of that era are very male centered. And in fact, a lot of it we know was very sexist and patriarchal. And so Sandra kind of goes in deep and turns that on its head, but again, without prettifying the story. She just gives it to us the way it really happened. Also, one thing I want to mention is that when we think about the Fela narrative, especially in the later years of his career, like after the attacks by the military began in '74 under Yakubu Gowon and under Obasanjo and Shagari and Babangida and on down the line, Sani Abacha, it's the narrative has been very embattled. It's like Fela he's a kind of a beleaguered figure, behind a barbed wire fence, electrified barbed wire fence with attacks imminent at any moment, and you never know when things are just going to blow up and go crazy. And I mean, I spent time in Fela's house. I know what the atmosphere was there, because you just never knew when the police or the army were going to attack. And it's kind of a very tense environment in certain ways, especially later in his life. So I think Sandra's book is very beautiful in the sense that it gives us a different angle on Fela. She encountered him when he was young and hopeful and full of utopian dreams. And it was LA in 1969, 1970. And it was like the heart of the American counterculture. And it was like, I was a kid in the 1960s. And from what I remember, everybody was dancing. Everywhere you went, people were dancing. I mean, that's why people still love that music today, because it was full of the utopian dreams and the good times and the economic affluence and the hopefulness of that era. And so we get to see that side of Fela having a great time, having a ball in LA, and having his mind blown by the things he encountered in Los Angeles, not only by Sandra, but by the music and the musicians and the politics. And then we see Sandra's side of that, how her life was changed and her mind was blown by her encounter with this musician who was really still trying to get himself together and still trying to, formulate what his contribution was going to be, which of course never would have become what it became without the influence of Sandra. So, you know, people, if you never met Fela, you don't know that he was a very funny guy. You know, he was like a genius as a humorist or a comedian, and um, and that side of him doesn't come out in the embattled, beleaguered narratives of his later life as Fela Nicolas Pukuti, as the embattled political dissident. So we get to see that early, you know, lighter side of Fela, which I think is very, very valuable. Uh, Music as a driver of Pan-Africanism. You know, there are people that think that the Pan-Africanist ideal is fantasy, or it's essentialist, or it's romanticized. But if it has any demonstrable currency, that's in the sphere of music, in which, you know, these musical styles have been bounced back and forth from historically from West and Central Africa into the diaspora, and then from different nodes in the diaspora, the Jamaicans influenced by the African Americans influenced by the Jamaicans, the Nigerians influenced by the Jamaicans, the Trinidadians, it's blah, 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 and on down the line. Not to mention the Francophone and Spanophone spheres, because that's a part of it too, you know? So um, the book is a very beautiful depiction of that. And I don't want to go on too long because I know we need time for the question and answer. But one thing I'd add is just the discussion of sexuality in this book, which some of the people I've talked to have had a problem with it because they think it's too graphic and too explicit. But I think it is actually great because it shows us how sexuality can be a generator of political visions, and that the inspiration, someone touched on this earlier this morning, that the inspiration that you can get from sex, you know, from a powerful sexual connection with another human being, transcends the sphere of just pleasure, but it can be a very powerful transformer of life, of a life or of people's lives. It can transform people's lives. It can transform their visions and their sense of possibilities for what their lives can be. Um, and then it can also go off the rails, you know, and what Sandra describes in the later chapters is an example of that. Um, you know, we get the highs of it and we get the lows of it. But I think, you know, because of how explicit the sexuality discourse has been around Fela, you know, because of how he presented himself, I think it's important that Sandra went in and kind of dealt with this head on and in very graphic terms, you know. I think it's actually a very valuable contribution of this book. I guess the last thing I'd mention is the whole one of the key questions or issues of the era of African independence or of post-colonial African culture, which is just the question of you know, what the value is of traditional culture in the modern era. So polygamy, for example, which Fela made a cornerstone of his presentation and his ideology. I mean, of course, his practice of polygamy was nothing like how polygamy actually operates in traditional culture. But he actually tried to present himself in that way and frame his activities in the context of polygamy. And so, how valuable is that practice in the modern era, you know? And a number of these traditional practices that Fela spent a lot of time promoting, whether it was chewing sticks, whether it was you know, water versus toilet tissue. You know, he has a whole song about that. Um, what was that? African message, don't worry about my mouth, or you know, there are other things. I can't recall all of them off the top of my head, but you know, these things, you know, just because they're traditional doesn't necessarily mean that they're continued, they're still valuable for us today. And so looking through his whole way of presenting himself as a polygamist raises that question of how, you know, how many of these traditional practices remain valuable for us today? Do they need to be discarded? Do they need to be tweaked and adjusted for the modern era, etc.? And you know, at the end of the day, Fela's behavior was no different than any other famous polygamous Yoruba man, whether we're talking about his nemesis, Olusegun Obasanjo or MKO Abiola, or anyone um, And obviously not only Yoruba people, but we talk about the Muslim rulers of Nigeria who have 10 and 15, 20, 30 wives. So at the end of the day, we have to think about this whole thing, this polygamy practice, and how useful for it is for us today. And is it a progressive element of African culture? Is it a regressive element? I could say more. I could say a lot more. Uh, Actually, I will just add one last thing very quickly, and that is just the downturn of the utopian visions of the independence era. We get to see that era at its height. Fela is someone, his parents were close friends with Kwame Nkrumah. And he, as a teenager and as a little boy, he would wake up in the middle of the night, as kids often do, and wander into the sitting room, and his parents would be sitting there discussing politics with Nkrumah in their family home. So he got to experience the highest of the highs of the Pan Africanist ideal and the hopes and dreams of African independence. And he also got to experience the lowest of the lows with everything that happened in Nigeria after the oil boom and the series of military dictatorships and the economic downturn and all of that. He was like that whole trajectory from Awo to Zeke, all the way to Sani Abacha and Babangida and all of that. He was an embodiment of that whole trajectory, which I guess we'd have to identify as a downward slide. There's a comment Sandra made to me, and she knows what I'm talking about. And I'm not going to say it, but she brought it up in another panel that we were on, so she might mention that. But Fela's whole life trajectory is really an embodiment of that whole political ideal that kind of went left, but which is currently experiencing a regeneration and a rebirth. So we can end on a positive note, and in that light, we can see Fela and Sandra's the laboratory of their love and their sexual relationship and their musical relationship and their political relationship as a harbinger of things that would ultimately come to pass. I think you're muted, Rosemary.
Oh, all right. Can you all hear me now? Okay, awesome. I just want to say thank you again to the panelists for choosing to participate in this celebration event. And I think the panel has achieved its objective, which is allow younger scholars of cultural studies like myself to dream from the well of wisdom and glean from many ways in which you all have researched popular music. I want us to do three things before we go to the Q&A session. Foremost, with the permission of the Queen Mother, I wonder if you don't mind if you have one moment of silence for your co-author, Shegun Oyekunle, who is now an ancestor. Are you fine with that? Because I imagine he would love to have been here if he were alive. And reading the acknowledgement of your book, I understand the important role he played in convincing you to write this narrative, situating yourself rather than using a pseudonym or a fake name or writing it as a fiction. Do I have your permission? I imagine she's in and out of sleep because it's too early in LA. Or maybe the technology we haven't. We'll just observe 1 minute of silence, I believe, is deserving of it for allowing us to put this narrative into the world and let many people know, like Professor Veal said, the important contribution that she made into to African and the diasporic connections that we have and we continue to have. Just 1 minute. And may the soul of Shegun Oyekule continue to rest with the ancestors. Earlier on today, I had a moment of wishful. She is, beautiful. Wow, thank you for joining us. So we just had
Thank you.
we just had one moment of silence for your co-author when I didn't hear from you, and we hope that it still continues to rest with the ancestors. And so before I hand over the microphone to you, earlier this morning, I had a wishful thinking with a colleague. I said, if I have the powers to do that, I want the Nigerian government to invite you nationally for national honor, maybe the MON and all of the alphabet, as part of not just celebrating your contribution, but your continuous role in political commentary on the reality of the country. And Professor Bill just said you're a very honest person, and that comes through your Facebook post about the suffering that Black people continue to go through, whether it's in Africa or in the African diaspora, your vulnerability, your honesty, and to echo Professor Bill, the book it revealed the full range of human emotion that you can find, the love, the joy, the conflict, the tension, and many other things. Before we hand over the floor to the Queen Mother, I just want the panelists to keep this at the back of your mind, thinking about what cultural studies scholars do with this very important book. What are the possibilities and values that we could individually, I know personally for myself, but for those who will watch this recording later on YouTube and on many other platforms that the LSA will post them, what cultural studies scholars do with this book? And more importantly, how can we move beyond objectification and sexualization as though it's the only thing that we can write about the women in Fela's life, to begin to consider the agency? And so on this note, I will hand over the floor to the Queen Mother for a comments, a response, or whatever you want to do with the 30 minutes.
Good morning from Los Angeles. And I mean, it's been a rough morning for me, but I'd like to thank each and every one of the panelists and for your commentary, which I found a bit surprising. I didn't know that in writing the book that I was just being honest about my own experience being in love with Fela. And personally, it was through the sex that we were able to speak politically about change. So when, if some people say too graphic, I was just being real and not rigid, because it's about being free. It's about expression, and it's about honesty. And that was the thing that I liked most about Fela, his honesty. And through the music, I realized that this is a way to educate. And Fela actually coined the phrase, "Let music be your weapon." And surprisingly, the masses didn't really hear or pay attention to those words, but the industry did. And it was during that time period, I say between 69, 70s, pretty much up until the late 70s, early 80s, music was empowering. It was used in a positive way. And I know for a fact that the record companies came together and they had a meeting about it, because the music was too impactful. So that music then was dummied down here in America. And the artists, if they weren't making derogatory statements in the music, things that would help increase violence in the city, where our prisons started to grow, and of course they did with Black and brown. It was very unhealthy, but the masses don't see this. And I thought, through music, but they in turn heard music as a weapon and actually used that weapon to destroy a generation. I say destroy because if you listen to the lyrical content and you look at the statistical records of what has happened, then you'll see change. I mean, you'll see the change, the progressive change. And I shouldn't say progressive because it was the deterioration to the point of where we are today in America. And America is a country where the rest of the world look for leadership. But look at, I know those of us in America, I don't know the ones outside, if you know exactly how bad things are here, politically. So positive music and to educate and uplift, telling the truth, has been something that has been suppressed. Now, I know there was discussion and things mentioned about polygamy. I don't think cultures should be changed or challenged, or, rocks thrown, which, is the title of one of my new songs. Hopefully I'll have the video soon, but being an independent artist, doing reggae and Afro beats and conscious music, mainstream is totally against that. And I know the musicians on this panel is very much aware of how the industry works. But hopefully with this new change in awareness and wanting this cancel culture that's here now, where strangely enough, TikTok, YouTube, and people that were suppressed and unable to be heard are now being heard with the internet. Thank you. So it's good. It's good to have the awareness and to try to educate and uplift, because like someone had mentioned earlier that Fela had this utopian, and yes, because we can live in harmony, we can build together, but there's energy or powers that be here in this world that it seems they don't want it to happen. And it's the manipulation of greed. Greed has a lot to do with it. But I know I'm kind of all over the place, but there's something else I want to say about the different musicians that I've met and, I'm still meeting, because I'm also, through my husband, Byron McNeish, I am still in the arena of what's happening now with the youth, the different artists of today. And it's what I'm seeing is really sad. And I know how the industry is pushing right now. They're pushing sex and homosexuality, just they're pushing a lot of things that go against the narrative of the wholesome moral, the way it used to be when I was a little girl, or the way it is in I would say China, Russia, and the Middle East. There's still some wholesomeness about it, in today's world. Their music is exposing and saying everything, which they are leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination. And in my opinion, it's destroying our youth. And at this point, I'll just stop talking.
Queen Mother, thank you. The organizer just told me that, just informed me that we have 15 more minutes before they kick us out for the next session. So I wanted us to do it this way. I wanted to respond to 2 questions, and then the panelists will say 1 or 2 things, final thoughts about the potential of this important book for us as cultural studies scholars, scholars of popular music, gender, and sexuality. So the first question is from Professor Kibona, asking about how did people receive your work? And what are you doing about marketability to get this book into more hands? So just this, if you could respond in 3 minutes so that the panelists can also say something.
Well, with the book, the release was in 2020 here in America. And at that time, I remember I was so excited, and I had people lined up where we would have like, I guess you could say it wasn't like, it was similar to a paint and sip, but people would come. It was a book signing parties where it would be festive entertainment, the book, and food. And then shortly thereafter, COVID happened. And a lot of the vendors and places that, or like you could say, tea bars where the book and we had arrangements, all of that went away. And when all of that went away due to the COVID crises, I just left it alone. I've had film writers and different people come to me, they propose deals, but nothing that really interests me because, number one, I'm not desperate, nor am I willing to bastardize or sell out. That's not me. I wouldn't do it in my music. I'm not going to do it with my book or none of the art forms. I am not a sellout, and I will not become a slave to the system. And so right now, my book, I look at it as truly a collector's copy because only 249 books entered into the US. Now, in Nigeria, I don't know what happened because Shegu Oyekunle is now an ancestor. And it was something that I didn't do this for survival. I did this so people could know. So as far as plans, I've more or less left it alone. And, I have a few books left, and that's it. Now, when a proper publishing company approaches me, then maybe we can sit down and talk about the book. I've had right now a couple of companies reach out, but nothing that I'm interested in yet. So I'm happy and content.
Thank you so much, Queen Mother. I will encourage scholars who teach Black women writing to consider putting this book on their syllabus. I think it qualifies to be among the list of among all the other literary works that we engage with in Black women's writing. I'll hand over the floor to each of the panelists as their name appears. Just say something in 2 minutes about the potential of this book and the ways in which they extend how we research popular music. And they told me they would kick us out at 2:15 exactly. So kindly make it brief. Professor Clark.
No, this has been definitely a great conversation. I think everyone contributing, from their definitely different perspectives. And so, again, I'll reiterate being able to appreciate a lot of the stories in the book and learning quite a bit about Fela. And also learning a lot about, I think, the perspectives, kind of like, I think some of the perceptions of African culture. I think they were interesting, some of the perceptions of who Africans are. And I think that was, a couple of times I smiled. So, I definitely appreciate, you telling your story, and definitely, yeah, I definitely enjoy reading the book. So thank you for writing it.
Well, thank you, Professor Clark. It's nice to speak to a fellow sister and hear what she has to say about my book. And as Professor Bill said, it's graphic a little. I was trying very to put it in the sweetest, nicest terms I could without being too graphic.
Which is why I said I think this is in terms of when it was published, I feel like this is, a right time for it, given what's out there and given the stuff this is like very PG compared to some of the stuff that's out there. So yeah,
Thank you.
So I love the graphic details because a chapter in my dissertation is on mourning music. So music about sexual pleasure and the erotics. And this is the best book, I think, to be like a starting point for the chapter. Next to Professor Bill, in case they cut us off, the people online can give their remarks later. Professor Bill, please.
Yeah, I would just say that speaking as an African American, you know what I mean? It's my deep feeling that the African American people will never be properly oriented in the world until we come to terms with our African heritage historically and contemporarily. And Sandra was one of the forerunners of that. And Fela, we lost him in 1997. Sandra is still here. She's still telling her story, and her story is being told by other people, meaning she's kept the faith, during that period in time in which the whole idea of the positive elements of an African and African American interaction was progressively downgraded and stomped on and discredited. She's kept the faith the whole time. And so I think there are lots of things that are valuable about that book, but I think at the core of it, that's the core of it for me. She never lost her inspiration. She kept the faith, and she's still here today. And like I said at the end of my comments, the idea seems to be coming back. And so the book is an amazing resource of that 50 or 60 years of Black history.
Thank you, Professor Bill, and Professor Shipley. We want to be on time so they don't kick us out virtually and in person.
Sure, I'll just keep it brief. I want to thank Sandra for writing this brilliant book. We've never met, and it's a real honor to have a chance to read it and comment and speak with you about it. I think it really reveals a kind of crucial history. I mean, Fela is this crucial icon, and your role in bringing a certain kind of politics to the global stage shouldn't be understated, and that's really important. So thank you very much. And I think to address your question, Rosemary, this is an important book to think about in terms of cultural studies and how to tell stories that then are tied into broader political movements so new generations can understand what came before, both the pleasures and possibilities and political hopes for a future. So thank you so much.
Oh, I'm still on. Okay, I think that from our conversation so far, the word objectification and commodification just keep popping up in my mind. I think that this book stands a chance because it sort of demystifies certain concepts, especially as it concerns African popular culture. I understand that different fields are affected, especially by technological advancements. So it's not about women just saying that they are always objectified and all that, and that women are no longer given the chance, because this book tells us otherwise. Everyone has a chance to voice out, everyone has a role to play, everyone has a chance to defend his or her own position. And Sandra has defended her position. So, I mean, women generally have a lot to learn in this book. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize to the live audience that we didn't have time to take Q&A. I apologize for any disappointment, but I promise you, if you email the Queen Mother, she will always respond. I remember when I first contacted, I'm like, will she respond? And then I got a response from her. I'll leave the final thoughts with you, but I just want to congratulate Professor Dotmaya Bade on your new book. And I want to promise panelists and participants here that I hope to find ways to continue conversations about the role of women in African and African diaspora expressive culture. On that note, Queen Mother, I'll leave you to say the final thoughts and whatever you want to say in 2 minutes, and then they will kick us out.
Yes, the one thing that I'd like to say is I look forward to the day that women recognize their power. So many women, we do not recognize our power. And we can be the source for change. And thank you to all the panelists that were here and all your kind words and insights. And whoa, you made me feel really good because it was just a book that I felt that needed to be written and for my side of the story to be told from me. Thank you.
Rosemary, you're muted.
Can you mute me? Am I unmuted now? Yeah, I say thank you to all the panelists. I've not met any of you in person, but your works and your books and your articles and book chapters have greatly influenced how I'm writing my second doctoral dissertation. And it will continue to shape how I continue to research popular music, popular culture, African diasporal expressive culture, and more. Thank you again. I'll reach out with a note of gratitude to say thank you for making time out of your very busy schedule and competing demand. Audience, I apologize again because we can't take Q&A. On that note, I'll see you all some other time when we further this conversation on whatever kind of platform. Bye, everyone, for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much.